Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be diving into a case that I think a lot of people probably remember. The Susan Smith case. Back in 1994, in South Carolina, a young mother reported that her car had been stolen with her two young sons inside.
Oh, wow.
And it instantly became national news. Everyone was following this.
Yeah, I remember this. I was pretty young then, but
Oh, really?
yeah, but I definitely remember it.
Yeah, you probably remember the missing person posters
Yeah.
with the faces of 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex
Hmm.
and candlelight vigils. And Susan Smith herself giving these tearful pleas on TV for their safe return.
Right, right. It's like one of those things that just grabs you and you're just hoping and praying that those kids are going to be found safe.
It was heart-wrenching. I mean, you felt so much for her, you know. And I think a lot of people were really pulled into this narrative.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, especially when it involves children, right? I mean,
Yeah.
everyone is afraid of random violence
Yeah.
and it seemed like such a clear-cut case at first.
Right.
Innocent mother, kids are just taken.
Yeah.
And everyone was rooting for her.
And I think that was one of the things that made it even more shocking when the truth finally came out.
Right.
Because for 9 days, the nation was just captivated by this search, you know. And behind the scenes, investigators are starting to see that things aren't adding up with Susan Smith's story. What it first looked like, you know, a random carjacking by a stranger
Yeah.
turned into something far more sinister.
Yeah, that's what I remember. It's like, wait a minute, hold on. Something's not right here.
Yeah.
What was it specifically? What didn't add up?
Well, I think for one thing, there was a lack of evidence to support her claims,
Oh, okay.
you know, about the carjacking
Right.
at the location she described.
Right, right.
And also, her demeanor, while she was clearly upset,
Yeah.
it didn't quite match what
Yeah.
you would expect
Yeah.
from a mother who's just had her kids kidnapped.
It's like almost like there's something else going on underneath.
Yeah, I think the investigators even mentioned that, you know, even though they're trained to be objective,
Right.
they're human too.
Yeah.
And it's easy to get caught up in the emotions of a case like this, especially when you're dealing with a seemingly distraught mother.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's like
I'm-
you want to believe her, right? You want to believe that she's telling the truth, and it's hard to accept that maybe she's not.
Right.
So when did things really start to shift?
Well, on November 3rd, 1994, just 9 days after she first reported her kids missing, Susan Smith confessed.
Wow.
And the truth
Yeah.
was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined.
Yeah.
She had driven her car into John D. Long Lake with Michael and Alex strapped inside,
Oh my God.
taking their lives in a premeditated act of filicide.
And just to be clear for our listeners, filicide is when a parent kills their own child.
Right. It's just a devastating thought that sometimes the greatest threats can come from those closest to us. You know, it shatters that foundation of trust.
Yeah, and I think that's what made this case so impactful, right? Because it wasn't just about the crime itself. It was about the betrayal, the fact that it was their mother who did this to them.
Absolutely. So how did the public react to this revelation? I mean, after days of empathizing with her, how did they process this betrayal?
Well, I think initially there was just utter disbelief. And then it quickly turned to anger and outrage. People felt like they'd been lied to and they'd been manipulated. They felt like they'd invested their emotions in this case. And it turned out to be completely different
Yeah.
than what they thought.
And I imagine the media also faced a lot of criticism.
Oh, absolutely. Because they had been, amplifying her story without, maybe scrutinizing it as closely as they should have.
Right. It's like this whole case really showed how powerful narratives can be and how easy it is to get swept up in them.
Yeah. And it also raised a lot of questions about mental health and the role of media in these high-profile cases. And of course, the big question, how do you seek justice when the perpetrator is a parent who's killed their own children?
Right. And that's something we'll definitely be digging into more as we go deeper into this case. Now, let's talk about the trial itself. It was a media spectacle, broadcasted nationwide. And the prosecution really focused on the premeditation of Susan Smith's actions. They presented evidence about her personal life, but ultimately they argued that her motive was to remove her children as obstacles to a new romantic relationship.
Okay, so there was someone else involved.
Yes, there was a man that Susan Smith was involved with, and he had expressed that he didn't want children.
Oh, wow.
So the prosecution used letters and testimony to establish that this relationship and her desire to be with this man played a significant role in her decision-making.
So basically, she saw her children as standing in the way of her happiness with this new man.
It's a heartbreaking detail. That just adds another layer of complexity to this already tragic case. So, with such a strong case against her, how did the defense counter the prosecution's argument? What was their strategy?
Well, that's what we're going to get into next. Because they had a very difficult task ahead of them, and their strategy really focused on trying to mitigate her culpability. And we'll talk about all that after the break. And so the defense, they couldn't deny that she'd killed her children. So they really focused on trying to reduce how responsible she was. They argued that she was suffering from severe depression and that she wasn't in her right mind when it happened.
Yeah, it seems like they were trying to make the case that she was just so overwhelmed by her circumstances, and she wasn't really capable of making rational decisions.
Right, exactly. They were trying to paint a picture of a woman who was just completely broken and not thinking clearly.
Do you think that strategy worked? I mean, did it sway public opinion or the jury's perception of her actions?
It's tough to say for sure, but it definitely sparked a wider conversation about mental health. Back in the mid-90s, postpartum depression wasn't as widely understood as it is today, so this case really forced people to think about the complexities of mental illness and how it can influence behavior.
Yeah, I think you're right. It wasn't just about one woman's actions. It really opened up a national dialogue about these issues.
Absolutely.
It challenged people's ideas about motherhood
Yeah.
and mental health, and even what it means to be criminally responsible.
For sure. And even though the defense didn't get her acquitted, I think it did raise awareness about mental health, which is really important.
Yeah, I agree. So was there any talk about whether she was even fit to stand trial, given her mental state?
That's a great question, and I don't have specific details on whether they formally evaluated her competency, but it is a crucial legal consideration in any trial, especially when mental health is a central issue.
Right, because if someone is found incompetent to stand trial, the trial can be postponed until they're able to understand the proceedings and participate in their own defense.
Exactly. It's all about ensuring fairness and due process.
Makes sense. Now, I know the prosecution ultimately decided not to seek the death penalty. What do you think influenced that decision?
Well, there could be a few factors at play. Maybe they considered the defense's arguments about her mental state and thought the jury might be swayed by that.
Right.
They also might have been worried about a successful appeal if they did seek the death penalty.
Yeah.
Plus, public opinion on the death penalty was starting to shift back then. People were becoming more concerned about its fairness.
So it seems like they had to really carefully consider not just the facts of the case, but also the bigger picture of mental health and capital punishment.
Absolutely. It's a delicate balance. Prosecutors have to weigh the severity of the crime, the defendant's culpability, and the impact of their decision on everyone involved.
So in the end, Susan Smith was found guilty of 2 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. But a lot of people felt like that wasn't harsh enough, considering what she did.
Yeah, there was a lot of controversy around the sentence.
What were some of the main arguments from those who felt like justice hadn't been served?
Well, they focused on the fact that she planned it, that it was premeditated. She took very specific steps to end her children's lives. And for many, that made it even more unforgivable. And they felt like taking 2 innocent lives, especially your own children, should have meant a harsher punishment.
Yeah, and I know the father, David Smith, has been very vocal about his opposition to her ever being released.
Right, and you can understand his anger and his pain.
Of course, losing 2 children like that is unimaginable.
Yeah.
And the fact that it was their own mother who did it.
It just adds another level of tragedy.
So let's talk about the parole hearings. She's had 2 now, one in 2014 and another this year, and both were denied. What kinds of things do parole boards look at when making these decisions, especially in a case like this?
Well, they usually consider a bunch of factors, like how serious the crime was, how the inmate has behaved in prison, what they've done to rehabilitate themselves, if they've shown remorse, and if there's still a danger to the public.
Right.
And they also consider the impact of the crime on the victims and their families.
So it's a tough job.
Trying to balance the prisoner's rights with the need to protect the public.
And I bet the pressure is even higher in a case like this, where the public is so invested.
Yeah, that definitely adds another layer of complexity.
Yeah.
Because they have to follow the legal guidelines. But they're also operating in a world where public opinion matters, especially when the media is paying so much attention.
Speaking of the media, this case really sparked a lot of debate about their role in high-profile cases. Some people argued that all the coverage, especially with the 24/7 news cycle becoming more common, turned it into a trial by media and maybe even influenced the legal process.
Yeah, that's a valid concern.
What do you think? Was the media's role appropriate, or did they cross a line?
It's a tough one. I mean, back then the 24/7 news cycle was really taking off, so you had all this constant coverage and speculation. Everyone was trying to get the latest scoop, and it could have created this atmosphere where it was hard to separate fact from fiction.
Yeah, and I mean, imagine this case happening today, with social media on top of everything else.
Oh,
It's
man.
kind of scary to think about.
It would be a whole other level of chaos, and probably a lot more damaging, too.
Right. It's like this case, even without social media, is a reminder of how powerful narratives can be and how important it is to think critically, especially with all the information flying around these days.
Absolutely. We have to be so careful about what we consume and what we share.
It's all about media literacy,
Yeah.
being able to figure out what sources are credible and what's just noise.
And being aware of our own biases, too,
Yeah.
because that can really color how we see things.
Before we wrap up, I want to go back to something we talked about earlier about the racial aspect of this case. Susan Smith initially said a black man had carjacked her
Right.
and taken her kids.
Right.
And that obviously had a huge impact. It reinforced these really harmful stereotypes, and it could have put black men at risk.
Yeah, it's awful to think about.
It just shows how deep-seated racism is in our society and how it can be exploited, even in a situation like this.
It's a reminder that we always have to be checking our own biases and questioning the information we're given. We can't just jump to conclusions based on someone's race.
Exactly. Justice should never come at the expense of perpetuating stereotypes. We have to make sure our legal system is fair for everyone.
Couldn't agree more.
So I think we've covered a lot today.
Yeah, we went pretty deep.
We started with the specifics of the Susan Smith case, the crime, the trial, the sentencing, but we ended up talking about some really big issues, like the power of narratives and the complexities of mental health, the role of the media, and the impact of racial bias.
Yeah, and that's what I love about these deep dives. We always end up connecting these individual events to the bigger picture.
It's about making connections and challenging our own assumptions.
And hopefully getting our listeners to think critically, too.
So to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this journey into the Susan Smith case. It's a story that raises so many questions about justice, forgiveness, and the human capacity for both love and unimaginable cruelty.
We encourage you to keep thinking about these themes, to question the narratives you encounter, and to have those tough conversations that can lead to a more just and empathetic world.
Until next time, keep seeking the truth, keep challenging those assumptions, and keep the conversation going.